On the surface level, the internet feels like a place to connect, a place where you can find people who share your passions, your struggles, or even your deepest secrets. But beneath the surface lies a much darker world. Imagine a website designed for people seeking solace in their pain, a place where suicide pacts are made. Now picture someone lurking there, not to find any sort of connections, but to prey on the most vulnerable, a man who turned a platform for despair into his personal hunting ground. Good morning, good evening, or perhaps good night. Welcome to today's video where we'll be going over some really morbid and disturbing topics regarding internet homicide. This case happened all the way in Japan, and it regards an individual who is sick and twisted and cruel. That being Hiroshi Maeue. Let's get into the case of Hiroshi Maeue and what exactly did he do. And just a quick note before we get started, I do have a script in front of me and I will be reading it as we go along in this video, because I cannot memorize anything for the life of me. Hiroshi Maeue was born on August 8th, 1968, in Osaka, Japan. Most of his childhood remains ambiguous. However, I found something interesting from when he was attending elementary school. So while attending elementary school, Hiroshi had read a mystery novel. And in this mystery novel, a character would suffocate their victims with a piece of cloth. Hiroshi would take huge influence from the way the character had killed their victim. The novel and the details of strangling would play a huge part in one of Hiroshi's violent fetishes, which was committing asphyxiation on others. And as described from sources, he had fulfilled his sexual desires by strangling others, or he would not feel any sexual pleasure from anything else. And at a very early age, something was wrong with Hiroshi. While in 5th grade, he would attempt to attack and suffocate fellow students. And when teachers got involved, he faced little to no repercussions, basically allowing for his violent tendencies to continue. His violent actions and weird fascinations wouldn't end there, as he would grow a fetish for people wearing socks. Regardless if they were female or male, he just liked seeing people wear white socks. Now, when I was researching this video, there wasn't an exact point of when this fetish started. However, one source did claim he gained this fetish from seeing a teacher wear these long white socks in his school. Most serial killers have a strange fetish where they derive pleasure from something obscure, such as Jerry Brudos, who had a fascination with women's shoes, and Charles Albright's fascination/fetishization of eyeballs. And Hiroshi doesn't fall very far from the tree of serial killers with his fascination of socks, or more specifically, white socks. Now, the first crimes committed by Hiroshi wouldn't lead to his eventual hanging. However, they were still vile and violent. Hiroshi would eventually go to a private college, Kanazawa Institute of Technology. In 1988, while attending the institution, he would strangle a fellow student, resulting in him being only suspended, not arrested, not going to a mental health asylum or anything like that, but just suspended. And afterwards, Hiroshi would be employed, after passing the civil service exam, basically a test to see if you're competent to be employed at anywhere. And Hiroshi would be employed at a postal office, where he would attempt to strangle a fellow coworker. And this time, thankfully, there were repercussions. An agreement would be settled in court, with the help of Hiroshi's father, who paid a settlement roughly estimating to 10 million yen, or 69,000 American dollars. Hiroshi would go to a psychiatric hospital after this event, where his attending physician diagnosed him with dissociative disorder. You would think after Hiroshi's history of violence and assault would cause the police or any law enforcement to step in, but that would not be the case, because now Hiroshi would target 2 women passing him by on the street. In 2001, Hiroshi's method of suffocating his victims would change, and he would attempt to suffocate both women with a towel, this time being soaked in benzene. This attempt would fail as it was out in public, and he was soon seen committing this act by bystanders. Hiroshi would only serve 1 year in prison and 3 years on probation due to his good behavior, and just a year later, he returned to his violent nature. So that following year, in April 2002, Hiroshi targeted someone much younger in public, a middle school male student. He would attempt to do the same method as he did previously, which was wrapping the cloth in benzene. However, this attempt was also in public, thankfully, and he was stopped. And he did face repercussions for this act. And what exactly were the repercussions this time? Just another measly 1 year and 10 months in prison. So how did Hiroshi keep escaping the confinements of prison? Well, I personally believe that at the time, people didn't fully grasp the concept of mental illness, and this caused Hiroshi just to be let off the leash in a sense. And before he was arrested for his failed attempt of suffocation and strangling on the middle school student, Hiroshi had opened this strange and morbid website where he basically posted fan fiction of his fantasies. And he titled this fanfiction The King of Choking. And in this fanfiction followed the main character, who would commit the murders Hiroshi had wanted to commit. Hiroshi would deny the existence of this website until his final time in court. And through this character named The King of Choking, Hiroshi would live out his sick and cruel fantasies, and he would later go on to commit those fantasies onto real people. In 2005, suicide websites had grown in popularity, and on these websites, users would discuss everything surrounding suicides. They would post questions like, what is the least painful way to die? Do you want to go out together? These are just some of the various posts that would be found on these forums. And of course, Hiroshi would find himself on these websites, not to take his own life, but to search for his victims. While posing as a user who had been on the verge of committing the act, he would find people who didn't want to go out alone. Hiroshi would post on the site about a failed attempt he had, of course, lied about. He would talk about how sleeping pills weren't strong enough, but the method he had discovered to be nearly successful was carbon monoxide poisoning, caused from a running car. Hiroshi in his post kept talking about this instance in which he was close to taking his own life. But what stopped him? The police came in time to rescue him. But he said if you wanted something strong enough to take your own life, carbon monoxide was the way to go. And additionally, he talked about tying your body so you don't fight the urge to escape the situation. But this would be a trap by Hiroshi. He would later go on to tie his victims in the car. And of course, Hiroshi ended the post by saying he was looking for someone to join him in the act of ending his own life. And before Hiroshi would go meet with his eventual victims, he would attempt to prepare for his murders and would gather a bunch of items. He would gather items such as zip ties, rubber gloves for the strangling, plastic bags, towels and gauze, paint thinner, and white socks for his own cruel fetish. Hiroshi was well aware of what he was doing, and additionally he would go on to rent a car, which would eventually lead to his arrest by him having receipts of renting a car. For the next segment of this video, we'll be going over Hiroshi's victims. And I looked at the court documents and they have the name of the victims omitted, such as Mrs. A, Mr. C, and Mr. D. And of course, to pay respects to the victims, I'll leave their names omitted, such as Mrs. A, Mr. C, Mr. D. Hiroshi's first victim was Mrs. A, who came from a very loving family and especially a loving mother. She was the oldest sibling of 2 younger brothers and a younger sister. She did pass middle school and graduate from there, however, she would drop out of high school due to unknown reasons. However, from sources we could speculate it was due to her depression and failed relationships. Right after dropping out of high school, Mrs. A would go on to work at a pachinko parlor, which is basically like a casino. However, gambling and slot machines are illegal in Japan, and a pachinko parlor basically gets out of this with a loophole. Now, the pachinko machine itself is basically like a pinball, but it's vertical, so you have to shoot the balls up into a slot, and then once you do that, you'll receive these balls which you can exchange for gifts. Not money, but gifts. And then once you get these gifts, you could exchange those gifts for money. So there's no direct exchange of money, making this a loophole, essentially. And to get back on track with Mrs. A, she would be hospitalized multiple times due to failed attempts at taking her own life. Her mom was devastated by this because throughout her childhood and now, her mother would care very deeply for her daughter. So hearing this obviously brought her mother down, but she still supported her daughter nonetheless. After these failed attempts of taking her own life and being hospitalized, Mrs. A would go on to be a hikikomori. Or if you don't know what that word means, it's basically a shut-in. Someone who stays inside their room all day and all the time, mostly due to depression and just wanting self-isolation. Now, a lot of hikikomoris spend time on the internet. And through the internet, we could discover some of the most worst things known to humanity. And Mrs. A stumbled upon the suicide website, where she would go on to eventually come into contact with Hiroshi Maeue. So Mrs. A stumbled upon Hiroshi's original post, where he talked about taking his life via carbon monoxide poisoning. And on that post, he talked about burning charcoal while you're locked inside the car. So basically, the individual would be locked inside this car, inhaling toxic fumes caused by the charcoal, damaging your lungs and eventually causing you to die. Mrs. A was very set on taking her own life, and seeing Hiroshi's post made her inspired. It's very dark, this whole entire situation. But she would go on to message Hiroshi 20 times, and afterwards Hiroshi would eventually set up a meeting. Before the two had met, Hiroshi had made sure she deleted all their messages together. This made it very obvious that Hiroshi had conspired to murder her and get away with it, or at least attempt to get away with this murder. Before the two had met, Hiroshi had rented out a car, and by renting out this car, he was hoping he would be able to cover up his tracks. But nope, this would eventually cause his downfall, as he'll have a history of renting a car at this one specific place. Hiroshi also gathered a lot of material I mentioned previously before this. Gloves, paint thinner, garbage bags, anything to cover up his murders. At this point, Mrs. A thought she would be taking her own life with Hiroshi. However, she was very wrong, as Hiroshi had darker intentions with her and her body. So with that being said, Hiroshi had picked up Mrs. A and drove her to a very isolated place in the mountains. Once alone in the mountains, Hiroshi zip ties Mrs. A's hands and feet together to prevent her from resisting. He then pressed gauze and towels soaked in paint thinner over her mouth, forcing her to lose consciousness. Each time she fainted, he slapped her awake, only to make her pass out again. He derived satisfaction from watching her agonized expressions as she drifted in and out of consciousness. He repeated this process until she was on the brink of death, barely responding. Frustrated by her lack of reaction due to her dying, Hiroshi strangles her to her ultimate death. Hiroshi enters a state of panic, not knowing what to do next, but the first thing that comes to his mind is to remove all of her clothes in an attempt to conceal her identity if anyone stumbles upon her corpse. But his dark thoughts don't end there. He attempts to bury her body near Kawachi Nagano City, in the forested outskirts near a riverbank. But once again, his depravity continues, as the next day he returns to the burial site to dig up her body and commit unspeakable acts, all while recording and taking photos of what he's doing. And just 4 days later, some scavenging animals would dig up the body, and some passerbys would see it and report it. However, once they reported it to law enforcement, they would not be able to identify the body, and this would be on the news and Hiroshi would see it. And since they could not identify the body, Hiroshi had thought he was in the clear. This gave Hiroshi a little bit of peace of mind. Now believing that this case would be difficult to solve, he believes he is a little bit of a criminal mastermind. He initially felt relieved. However, he had this growing paranoia that he would eventually be caught, and with that, he avoided the suicide website for quite some time. However, he could not hold his desires for much longer, as in a few months he would return to the website and lure out his next victim. And now, Hiroshi would be claiming his second victim, Mr. C. He had just been a 14-year-old boy and already had thoughts of suicide. He made his own post on his site and Hiroshi would contact him from there. Mr. C had been a bright student from a loving family. Case documents noted that he had cherished summer vacations and dreamed of either becoming a lawyer or a computer programmer. However, during his third year of junior college or 8th grade, He began struggling with anxieties about school and his future. His growing despair led to hospitalization for depression. But given his young age, doctors remained hopeful that he would recover. Hiroshi was the one who first messaged Mr. C, thinking he was an easy target because of his young age and his vulnerability. And using the same manipulative tactics that he did on Mrs. A to lure her out, he did the same to Mr. C, the young boy. And once again, Hiroshi had instructed his victim to delete all their messages of them texting together. But this time, Mr. C sent one final text to a friend, saying he was meeting a man from Osaka. On the night of May 21st, 2005, Hiroshi had rented out a car and gathered the same tools he used on Mrs. A to eventually use on Mr. C. They arranged a meeting point at a train station, and once alone, he basically abducted the young boy. And once he had Mr. C in the car with him, he drove to the same remote area and where he killed Mrs. A at. Once alone, Hiroshi zip ties Mr. C's feet and hands together. It's obvious it was intended that this was never going to be a mutual suicide. Wearing rubber gloves, Hiroshi began strangling the young boy, but it wasn't as easy as he anticipated, because Mr. C fought back and attempted to say some things, like "Why are you doing this?" or "It's not right to kill." However, Hiroshi's response was very detached. He said nothing, and he was recording all while violating him at the same time. And just as he did before with Mrs. A, he would suffocate him to unconsciousness and revive him with a slap on his face. With towels and gauze soaked in paint thinner, he covered Mr. C's nose and mouth for 10 agonizing minutes until the boy stopped breathing. And like he did to his previous victim, Mrs. A, he stripped Mr. C of all his clothes in an attempt to discard his identity. And instead of burying his body, he just left it by a nearby trail. Now a few days would pass, and Mr. C's family was already growing scared. They didn't know what happened to their young boy. And knowing his history of mental illness, they have feared that the worst has already came. Hiroshi would feed into their ever-growing fear by placing a phone call to Mr. C's father. Posing as a kidnapper, he would demand 4 million yen to Mr. C's father and say, "If you don't give me this money, you'll never ever see your son again." To further torment Mr. C's family, Hiroshi had supposedly used a voice synthesizer. He even attempted to mimic Mr. C's voice to harass his grieving family. When the family reported the kidnapping to the police and it made headlines, Hiroshi would leave one chilling phone call, saying, "It's too late. I've already killed your son and it's all your fault for going to the police." Hiroshi is a really depraved and sick individual. The family would never see their son again. His body wouldn't be discovered until August 6, 2005, where his corpse nearly decomposed into a skeleton. Hiroshi's third and final victim was Mr. D, who was the eldest of 4 siblings and came from a loving but very strict household. As Mr. D grew older, he moved out of his family's household and attended a university. However, he had trouble balancing his part-time job and studies, and he believed he was a financial burden on his family. This caused him to grow into a sort of depression, and he was very anxious all the time. However, during his 3rd year, his academic progress took a hit. He failed to earn enough credits and was forced to repeat a year. The weight of his struggle soon pushed him into a deep depression. He withdrew from social interactions and eventually sought psychiatric help. His father offered guidance and support throughout all of his struggles. However, that was not enough, as Mr. D was set on taking his own life, and soon began browsing those same websites where Hiroshi had preyed on his victims. Just a month before Mr. D would come into contact with Hiroshi, he was just 21, and he appeared to be in good spirits with people around him, or more specifically his family. But they didn't know that Mr. D had been browsing the websites, and he would make his own posts, and that is how Hiroshi found him and emailed him. And as previously, Hiroshi would message him. Their exchanges followed the same pattern as Hiroshi's previous victims. Hiroshi posed as a man looking for someone else to commit suicide alongside him, and suggested the use of carbon monoxide poisoning. On June 10th, 2005, Hiroshi arranged to meet Mr. D in a vacant parking lot. But this time, Hiroshi planned to escalate his cruelty. He introduced a new tool,
a plastic bag with a towel soaked in paint thinner inside. His intent was to suffocate his victim while forcing him to inhale the toxic fumes, prolonging his suffering. After driving to the same secluded mountain area as he did with his previous victims, Hiroshi placed a bag over Mr. D's head without any hesitation. Trapping the chemical-soaked towel inside, Mr. D thrashed around, struggling to breathe as he was inhaling the toxic fumes. When Mr. D lost consciousness, Hiroshi would follow his twisted ritual, slapping his victim awake only to make him pass out again. He reveled in the pain, pushing Mr. D to the very limits of human suffering. But this time something was different. Between every time Hiroshi would strangle Mr. D, he would allow Mr. D a cigarette break. Basically, Mr. D and Hiroshi would share cigarettes. Mr. D was scared out of his mind, asking, "Why are you doing this? What do you have to gain from this?" Hiroshi responded with, "I won't kill you so fast. It's my hobby and fetish to watch people like you suffer." Those would be some of the last words Mr. D would ever hear. For the final time, Hiroshi pulled the bag over his victim's head, pressing down firmly. When the body felt still, he loaded it into his car and drove deeper into the forest. This time, he didn't even bother digging a hole, but he just threw the corpse of Mr. D off a nearby cliff. On August 7th, 2005, Mr. D's skeletal remains were found. By then, nature had stripped nearly all traces of Mr. D's identity. Hiroshi Maeue had believed he had taken every precaution to avoid his eventual capture. After each murder, he would thoroughly clean each rental car he used, washing the tires to remove dirt, wiping down every surface to remove any traces of fingerprints, and he would even use adhesive tape to pick up any stray hairs that were left behind by his victims. And of course, as one does, he would run every rental car through an automated car wash, ensuring that no trace was left behind. He also instructed each victim to delete any history of their messages together, ensuring that there was no trace left behind. He was convinced that this had erased all evidence of any of his connections to his poor victims. But as some of you know, digital footprints can never be truly erased. And with that information, forensic investigators got quickly to work to recover deleted messages that were found on the victims' phones. To further cover his tracks, Hiroshi often used computers at internet cafes instead of his personal device. He was confident he had built an untraceable web of deception, but what he failed to consider was the digital trail he had already left behind. At this point, all investigators really needed to do was to access the victims' devices by recovering deleted messages, checking rental car contracts, and analyzing communication records. The police found a common link between every disappearance, and that of course was Hiroshi Maeue. And on August 5th, 2005, police would take in Hiroshi as prime suspect for the disappearance of Mrs. A. The recovered messages between them, along with rental car records, provided enough evidence to tie him to the crimes. Initially, Hiroshi confessed only to her murder, but as the interrogation continued, he admitted to the killings of Mr. C and Mr. D as well. With chilling precision, Hiroshi detailed each murder and even accompanied law enforcement to the remote sites where he had left his victims. By then, the bodies of Mr. C and Mr. D had decomposed to skeletal remains. Despite the weight of his crimes, Hiroshi showed no remorse. He accepted his fate without resistance. On July 28, 2009, Hiroshi Maeue was hanged alongside another convicted murderer, Yukio Yamaji. Hiroshi Maeue's reign of terror had finally ended. Hiroshi Maeue's case is a stark reminder of the dangers that can occur when individuals seek some sort of connection in the wrong places. His ability to exploit those with mental health issues underscores the importance of providing better support systems for those in crisis. Online safety and mental health awareness are more important more now than ever, as predators like Hiroshi Maeue preyed on those who were isolated and hopeless. And that concludes it for today's video on the case of Hiroshi Maeue and internet homicides as a whole. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative. I didn't know about this case before researching internet homicides, and seeing it surprised me. Anyways, I'll leave all links to my sources in the description,
And I hope you stick around to my channel and like and subscribe. I'll see you all later.